Hello everybody. Today we will be talking about the classical and neoclassical thought, which is choice or consequences. Now, after today's lesson, you should be able to recognize the following questions. Number one, what are the major principles of classical school of thought or classical school of criminology? Number two, what were some of the forerunners of classical thought in criminology? And what is the relevance of history of criminology and its early thinkers to current views of crime and criminality? Point 3. Who were some important thinkers of classical school of criminology and what was their legacy? 4. What is neoclassical criminology and how does it differ from the classical perspective? How does it build on it? 5. What is the role of punishment in neoclassical criminology? 6. What are the policy implications of the classical school and neoclassical thought? And 7. What are the shortcomings of classical and neoclassical perspectives on crime? So to begin with, a number of crimes are relatively spontaneous, unplanned events that occur in the heat of passion or when unanticipated opportunity presents itself. A wallet left on the seat of an unlocked car with the window rolled down, for example, is an invitation for anyone walking by to steal the wallet, and some people will be unable to resist the temptation to reach out and grab it. The majority of crimes, however, are likely planned, at least to some degree. Crime planning, which involves rational decision making on the part of the offender, means not only that criminals assess the pros and cons of perpetrating offenses, the benefits versus the likelihood of being caught and punished, but also means of crime commission. So what we will talk about today will essentially be examining the belief that at least some illegal activity is the result of rational choices made by individuals seeking various kinds of illicit rewards. The perspectives presented in this lesson form the basis for strict policies and social control, those based on punishment as a primary means for curtailing continued criminality. And as you listen to this lesson, however, consider how the theoretical approaches that it describes can effectively counter the reward of crime that might be imagined by those who are considering violating the law. Now, major principles of the classical school. So what are the major principles of the classical school of criminology? So here we will summarize the central features of the classical school of criminological thought, and each of the points listed in this discussion can be found elsewhere in this lesson, but the overview is intended to provide a summation and to be a guide to the rest of the lesson. So let's imagine a table, and in the table we have classical school on the left-hand side and neoclassical school on the right-hand side. So if you think about the period, classical school started or operated between 1700s to 1880s versus neoclassical criminology. It started around the 1970s and it's present in today's time. Some of the theorists of classical criminology include Cesare Beccaria, Jeremy Bentham, and a few others. Neoclassical criminology, some of the theorists are Lawrence Cohen, Marcus Felson, Ronald V. Clark, Derek B. Cornish, and a few others. The concepts of classical criminology is free will, deterrence through punishment, social contract, natural law, due process, and panopticon, versus neoclassical criminology is rational choice, routine activities, capable guardians, situational crime prevention, just deserts, determinate sentencing, specific deterrence, and general deterrence. So moving forward, most classical theories of crime causation make the following basic assumptions. Human beings are fundamentally rational, and most human behavior is the result of free will coupled with rational choice. The next point. Pain and pleasure are two central determining factors of human behavior. The next point. Punishment serves to deter law violators, serves as an example to others who might contemplate violating the law. Moving to the next point, the principles of right and wrong are inherent in our nature and cannot be denied. The following point, society exists to provide benefits to individuals that they would not receive in isolation. The next point, when people band together for the protection offered by the society, they forfeit some of their personal freedoms in order to enjoy the benefits of living among others cooperatively. Next point, certain key rights of the individual are necessary in the enjoyment of life, and governments that restrict and prohibit the exercise of those rights should be disbanded. And the last point, crime lessens the quality of the contractual bond that exists between individual and their society. Therefore, criminal acts cannot be tolerated by any members if everyone wants to receive the most benefit from the living in a cooperative city, or a society, I should say. Okay, so moving forward to learning about the forerunners of the classical thought. So, what were some of the forerunners of classical thought in criminology, and what is the relevance of the history of criminology and its early thinkers to current views of crime and criminality? So, the notion of crime as a violation of established law did not exist in most primitive societies. Lack of law-making bodies, absence of formal written laws, and loose social bonds preluded the concept of crime as a violation, but all human societies, from the simplest to the most advanced, did evidence their own widely held notions of right and wrong. Sociologists termed such fundamental concepts of morality and propriety as mores and folkways. Mores, folkways, and law were terms used by William Graham Sumner to describe the three basic forms of behavioral strictures imposed by social groups upon their members. Mores and folkways govern behavior in relatively small primitive societies, whereas in large complex societies they are reinforced and formalized through written laws. Mores consist of proscriptions covering potentially serious violations of groups' values, for example, murder, sexual assault, and robbery. Folkways are time-honored customs, although they carry the force of tradition. Their violation is less likely to threaten the survival of the social group. The fact that Canadian men have traditionally worn little jewelry illustrates a folkway that has given way in recent years to various types of male adornment, including earrings, gold chains, and makeup. Although they may be powerful determinants of behavior, mores and folkways are nonetheless informal, but only laws have been codified into formal strictures wielded by institutions and created specifically for enforcement purposes. Another method of categorizing social proscriptive rules is provided by criminologists who divide crimes into the dual categories of mala in se and mala prohibita. Acts that are mala in se are said to be fundamentally wrong, regardless of the time or place in which they occur. For example, forcing someone to have sex against their will and the intentional killing of children. Those who argue for the existence of mala in se offenses usually point to some fundamental rule, such as religious teachings, the Bible's 10 Commandments, the Quran, etc., to support their belief that some acts are inherently wrong. Offenses termed mala prohibita are said to be wrong in areas where they are prohibited, for example, prostitution, gambling, drug use, and premarital sexual behavior. The status of such behavior as mala prohibita is supported by the fact that they are not necessarily crimes in every jurisdiction. Gambling, for example, is legal in parts of Canada, mainly because of the huge revenue potential it holds. Speaking of the demonic era, now since time began, humankind has been preoccupied with what appears to be an ongoing war between good and evil. Evil has often appeared in impersonal guise, as when the great bubonic plague, the Black Death, ravaged Europe and Asia in the 14th century, leaving as much as three-quarters of the population dead in a span of 20 years. At other times, evil has seemed to wear a human face, as when the Nazi Holocaust claimed millions of Jewish lives during World War II. Whatever its manifestation, the very presence of evil in the world has begged for interpretation, and sage minds throughout human history have advanced many explanations for the evil conditions that individuals and social groups have at times been forced to endure. Some forms of evil, such as the plague and the Holocaust, appear cosmically based, whereas others, including personal victimization, criminality, and singular instances of deviance, are the undeniable result of human individual behavior. Cosmic level evil has been explained by ideas as diverse and divine punishment, karma, fate, and the vengeful activities of offended gods. Early explanations of personal deviance range from demonic possession to spiritual influences to temptation by fallen angels. So, what are the early sources of criminal law? The Code of Hammurabi. Modern criminal law is a result of a long evolution of legal principles, and the Code of Hammurabi is one of the first known bodies of law to survive for study today. King Hammurabi ruled the ancient city of Babylon from 1972 to 1970 BCE and created a legal code consisting of strictures that were originally intended to establish property and other rights, and that were crucial to the continued growth of Babylon as a significant commercial center. Hammurabi's law spoke to issues of theft, property ownership, sexual relationships, and interpersonal violence. Well-known criminologist Marvin Wolfgang observed in its stay 1700 BCE, the Code Hammurabi, with its emphasis on retribution, amounted to a brilliant advance in penal philosophy, mainly because it represented an attempt to keep cruelty within bounds. Prior to the code, captured offenders often faced the most barbarous retribution, frequently at the hands of revenge-seeking victims, no matter how minor their transgressions had been. Now moving on to early Roman law. Of considerable significance for our own legal tradition is early Roman law. Roman legions under Emperor Claudius I, 10 BCE to 54 CE, conquered England in the middle of the 1st century, and Roman customs, law, and language were forced upon the English population during the succeeding 3 centuries under the Pax Romana, a peace imposed by the military might of Rome. Early Roman law derived from the 12 Tables, a collection of basic rules regulating family, religion, and economic life, written around 450 BCE. They appear to have been based on common and fair practices generally accepted among early tribes that existed prior to the establishment of the Roman Republic. Only fragments of the table survive today. The best-known legal period in Roman history occurred during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, 527 to 565 CE. By the end of the 6th century, the Roman Empire had declined substantially in size and influence and was near the end of its life. Possibly to preserve Roman values and traditions, Justinian undertook the laborious process of distilling Roman law into a set of writings. The Justinian Code as these writings came to be known, actually consisted of three lengthy legal documents: the Institutes, the Digest, and the Code itself, and distinguished between two major categories: public and private laws. Public laws dealt with the organization of the Roman state, its senate and governmental offices. Private law concerned itself with contracts, personal possessions, the legal status of various types of persons, citizens, free will, slaves, freedmen, guardians, husbands, and wives, and injuries to citizens. It contained elements of our modern civil and criminal law and influenced Western legal thought through the Middle Ages. Common law refers to the traditional body of unwritten legal precedents created throughout everyday practice in English society. It was based on shared traditions and standards and was supported by court decisions during the Middle Ages. As novel situations arose and were handled by British justices, their declarations became the start for any similar future deliberation. Common law was given considerable legitimacy in the 11th century with the official declaration by the English King Edward the Confessor, 1042 to 1066 CE, that it was the law of the land. The authority of common law was further reinforced by the decision of William the Conqueror to use popular customs as the basis for a judicial action following his subjugation of Britain in 1066 CE. So eventually, court decisions were recorded and made available to barristers, English trial lawyers, and judges. As criminologist Howard Abadinsky wrote, common law involved the transformation of community rules into a national legal system. The controlling element was precedent. Today, common law forms the basis for much of our statutory and case law and has been called the major source of modern law in English-speaking countries around the world. Moving on to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, literally known as Great Charter, another important source of modern laws and legal procedure, was signed on June 15, 1215 by King John of England at Runnymede under pressure from British barons who took advantage of his military defeats to demand a pledge to respect their traditional rights and to be bound by the law. At the time of its signing, the Magna Carta, 63 chapters in length, was little more than a feudal document listing specific royal concessions. Its original purposes were to ensure feudal rights, to guarantee that the king would not encroach on the land-owning barons' privileges, and to ensure respect for the customs of towns. Its wording was later interpreted during a judicial revolt in 1613, however, to support individual rights and jury trials. Sir Edward Coke, Chief Justice under James I, held that the Magna Carta guaranteed basic liberties for all British citizens and ruled that any acts of Parliament that contravened Roman law would be void. Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms assures this fundamental right for Canadians today. Similarly, a specific provision of the Magna Carta, designed originally to prohibit the king from prosecuting the barons without just cause, was expanded into the concept of due process of law, a cornerstone of modern legal procedure. And because of these later interpretations, the Magna Carta has been called the foundation stone of our present liberties. Moving on to the Enlightenment or Enlightenment or the Age of the Reason. It was highly significant social movement occurring during the late 17th to 18th centuries, was built upon ideas developed by many important thinkers. Because of their indirect contributions to classical criminological thought, it was worthwhile to briefly discuss the writings of a few of these historical figures. The first one is Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, developed many writers what they regard as an extremely negative view of human nature and social life, which he described in his momentous work Leviathan, 1651. Fear of violent death, he said, forces human being into a social contract with one another to create a state that demands the surrender of certain natural rights and submission to the absolute authority of a sovereign while offering protection and secure to its citizens. The social contract concept significantly influenced many Hobbes' contemporaries, but much of his writing was condemned for assuming an overly pessimistic view of both human nature and existing governments. The next one is John Locke. In 1690, the English philosopher John Locke, 1632 to 1704, published his essay concerning human understanding, in which he put forth the idea that the natural human condition at birth is akin to that of a blank slate upon which interpersonal encounters and other experiences undeniably inscribe the traits of personality. And in contrast to early thinkers who assumed that people are born with certain innate propensities and even rudimentary intellectual concepts and ideas, Locke described the bulk of adult human qualities to life experiences. In the area of social and political thought, Locke further developed the Hobbesian notion of the social contract and contended that human beings, through a social contract, abandon their natural state of individual freedom and lack of interpersonal responsibility to join together and form society. Although individuals surrender some freedoms to society, government, once formed, is obligated to assume responsibilities toward its citizens, to provide for their protection and welfare, and to guarantee them certain inalienable rights, such as the right to life, health, liberty, and possessions. A product of his times, the dictatorial nature of monarchies and the Roman Church were being much disparaged. Locke stressed the duties that governments have toward their citizens while paying very little attention to the responsibilities of individuals, to the societies of which they are a part. And he argued the political revolutions under some circumstances might become an obligation incumbent upon citizens. Locke also developed the notion of checks and balances between divisions of government, a doctrine elaborated on the French jurist and political philosopher Charles Louis de Seconded Montesquieu from 1689 to 1755 in The Spirits of Laws in 1748. Montesquieu wove Locke's notions into the concept of separation of powers between divisions of government. The Canadian parliamentary system is based on these very principles. Moving on to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Swiss-French philosopher and political theorist Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, further advanced the notion of the social contract in his treatise of the name Social Contract, 1762, stating that human beings are basically good and fair in their natural state, but historically were corrupted by the introduction of shared concepts and joint activities such as property, agriculture, science, and commerce. As a result, the social contract emerged when civilized people agreed to establish governments and systems of education to correct the problems and inequalities brought on by the rise of civilization. Rousseau also contributed to the notion of natural law, a concept originally formulated by Saint Thomas Aquinas 1225 to 1274, Baruch Spinoza, 1632 and 1677, and others to provide an intuitive basis for the defense of ethical principles and morality. Natural law was used by early Christian church leaders as a powerful argument in support of their interests. Submissive to the authority of the church, secular rulers were pressed to reinforce church doctrine into any laws that decreed. Aquinas wrote in his Summa Theologica that any human-made law that contradicts natural law is corrupt in the eyes of God. Hence, natural law was incorporated into English common law throughout the Middle Ages. Rousseau agreed with earlier writers that certain immutable laws are fundamental to human nature and can be readily ascertained through reason. Human-made law, or positive law in contrast, derives from human experience and history, both of which are subject to continual change and thus changes from time to time and from epoch to epoch. Rousseau expanded the concept of natural law to support emerging democratic principles. Moving on to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, from 1737 to 1809, who was an English-American political theorist and an author of The Rights of Man, 1971 and 1972, defended the French Revolution, arguing that only democratic institutions could guarantee individuals' natural right. For example, commentators have cited the crimes against humanity committed by Nazis during World War II as contravening natural law principles. The chilling testimony of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy during the 1945 war crimes trial in Nuremberg, Germany, as he recalled the Führer's order to exterminate millions of Jews, indicates the extent of the planned final solution. In the summer of 1941, I was summoned to Berlin to reach Führer SS Himmler to receive personal orders. He told me something to the effect, I do not remember the exact words, that the Führer had given me to order for a final solution of the Jewish question. We, the SS, must carry out the order. If it is not carried out now, then the Jews will later on destroy the German people. He had chosen Auschwitz on account of its easy access by rail, and also because the extensive site offered space for measures ensuring isolation. So that was the commentary made by Hitler's deputy, Hess. So although Hitler's Nazi party made the law in Germany at the time, natural law supporters, largely in other countries, argued that Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question was inherently wrong and that any laws passed in furtherance of it were immoral and should be struck down. Although the concept of natural law had waned somewhat in influence over the past half-century, many people today still maintain that the basis of various existing criminal laws can be found in immutable moral principles or some other identifiable aspect of the natural order. Modern-day advocates of natural law claim that it comes from outside the social group and that it is knowable through some form of revelation, intuition, and prophecy. The debate over abortion is an example of modern-day use of natural law arguments to support both sides in the dispute. Those who oppose abortion, frequently called pro-lifters or right-to-lifters, claim that an unborn fetus is a person that they are entitled to all the protection we would give to any other living human being, and that such protection is basic and humane and lies in the natural relationship of one human being to another and within the relationship of a society to its children. So, abortion advocates, also called pro choice, maintain that abortion is a right of any pregnant woman because she is the only one who should be in control of her body, and claim that the legal system must address the abortion question by offering protection for this natural right. Now, speaking about the classical school, who were some of the important thinkers of the classical school of criminology and what was their legacy? The Enlightenment fueled the fires of social change, leading eventually to French and American revolutions. It also inspired other social movements and freed innovative thinkers from the change of convention. As a direct consequence of Enlightenment thinking, superstitious beliefs were discarded, and men and women became to be perceived for the first time as self-determining entities, possessing a fundamental freedom of choice. Free will and rational thought came to be recognized as the linchpins of all significant human activity. In effect, the Enlightenment period, or the Enlightenment itself, inspired the re-examination of existing doctrines of human behavior from the point of view of rationalism. When criminology, or within criminology, the Enlightenment led to the development of the classical school of criminological thought. Crime and deviance, which had been previously explained by reference to the mythological influences and spiritual shortcomings, took their place in Enlightenment thought alongside other forms of human activity as products of the exercise of free will. Once people were seen as having control over their lives, crime came to be explained as a particularly individualized form of evil, that is, as a moral wrongdoing fed by personal choice. Speaking of Cesare Beccaria from 1738 to 1794 was born in Milan, Italy, the eldest of 4 children. He was trained at Catholic schools and earned a Doctor of Law degree by the time he was 20. In 1764, Beccaria published his essay on crimes and punishments, which consisted of 42 short chapters covering a few major themes to communicate his observations of the law and justice system of his time. In the essay, Beccaria distilled the notion of social contract into the idea that laws are the conditions under which independent and isolated men united to form a society. More than anything else, his writing consisted of a philosophy of punishment. Beccaria claimed that the purpose of punishment should be deterrence rather than retribution, and punishment should be imposed to prevent offenders from committing additional crimes. Beccaria saw punishment as a means to an end and not an end in itself. And crime prevention was more important to him than revenge. To help prevent crimes, Beccaria argued education and punishment should be both swift, and once punishment is decreed, certain, the more promptly and the more closely punishment follows upon the commission of a crime, the more just and useful it will be. Punishment that is imposed immediately following crime commission, according to Beccaria, is connected with the wrongfulness of the offense, both in mind of the offender and in the minds of others who might see the punishment imposed and thereby learn of the consequences of involvement in criminal activity. Beccaria concluded that punishment should only serve enough to outweigh the personal benefits to the derived to be derived from crime commission, and that any additional punishment would be superfluous. In order, he said, for punishment not to be, in every instance, an act of violence of one or one of many against a private citizen, it must be essentially public, prompt, necessary, the least possible in the given circumstances, proportionate to the crimes, and dictated by the laws. Beccaria distinguished among the three types of crimes: those that threatened the security of the state, those that injured citizens or their property, and those that ran contrary to the social order. Punishment should fit the crime. Theft should be punished through fines, personal injury through corporal punishment, and serious crimes against the state, such as inciting revolution via application of death penalty. Beccaria was opposed to the death penalty in most other circumstances, seeing it as a kind of warfare waged against some society, or a warfare waged by society against its citizens. Beccaria condemned the torture of suspects, a practice still used in the 18th century, saying that it was a device that ensured that weak suspects would incriminate themselves, whereas strong ones would be found innocent. Torture was also unjust because it punished individuals before they had been found guilty in a court of law. And in Beccaria's words, no man can be called guilty before a judge has sentenced him, nor can society deprive him of public protection before it has been decided that he has, in fact, violated the conditions under which such protection was accorded him. What right is it then, if not simply that of might, which empowers a judge to inflict permanent or punishment on a citizen while doubt still remains as to his guilt or innocence? Beccaria's essay touched upon a variety of other topics. He distinguished, for example, between two types of proof: perfect proof, where there was no possibility of innocence, and imperfect proof, where some possibility of innocence remained. Beccaria also believed in the efficacy of a jury of one's peers, recommending that half of any jury panel consist of the victim's peers and half consist of the accused's peers. Beccaria's ideas were widely recognized as progressively by his contemporaries. His principles were incorporated into the French Penal Code of 1791 and significantly influenced the justice-related activities of European leaders such as Catherine the Great of Russia, Frederick the Great of Prussia, Emperor Joseph II of Austria, and the framers of the American Constitution. Perhaps, more than anyone else, Beccaria is responsible for the contemporary belief that criminals have control over their behavior, that they choose to commit crimes, and that they can be deterred by the threat of punishment. Moving on to Jeremy Bentham. Bentham, 1748 to 1832, another founder of the classical school, wrote in his traditional write-up, Introduction to his Principles of Morals and Legislation, which was written in 1789, that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. To reduce crime, or as Bentham put it, to prevent the happening of mischief, the pain of crime commission must outweigh the pleasure to be derived from criminal activity. Bentham's claim rested upon his belief, spawned by Enlightenment thought, that human beings are fundamentally irrational and that criminals will weigh in their minds the pain of punishment against any pleasures thought likely to be derived from crime commission. Bentham advocated neither extreme nor cruel punishment, only punishment sufficiently distasteful to the offender that the discomfort experienced would outweigh the pleasure to be derived from criminal activity. The more serious the offense is, the more reward it holds for its perpetrator, and therefore the more weighty the official response must be. Pain and pleasure, said Bentham, and the instruments the legislator has to work with in controlling antisocial and criminal behavior. Bentham's approach has been termed hedonistic calculus or utilitarianism because of its emphasis on the worth that any action holds for an individual undertaking it. Bentham stated, by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what it is the same thing. To promote or to oppose that happiness, in other words, Bentham believed that individuals could be expected to weigh the consequences of their behavior before acting to maximize their pleasure and minimize their pain based on intensity, duration, certainty, immediacy, or remoteness in time. Like Beccaria, Bentham focused on the potential held by punishment to prevent crime and to act as a deterrent for those considering criminal activity. Regarding criminal legislation, he wrote that the evils of punishment must be made to exceed the advantage of the offense. Bentham distinguished among 11 types of punishment. 1. Capital punishment or death. 2. Afflictive punishment, whipping and starvation. 3. Indelible punishment, branding, amputation, and mutilation. 4. Ignominious punishment, public punishment involving use of stocks or pillory. 5. Penitential punishment, censure by the community. 6. Chronic punishment, banishment, exile, and imprisonment. 7. Restrictive punishment, license revocation and administrative sanction. 8. Compulsive punishment, restitution and appointment with probation officer. 9. Pecuniary punishment, fine. 10. Quasi-pecuniary punishment, denial of services of otherwise available. And 11. Characteristic punishment, mandates such as wearing prison uniforms. So utilitarianism is a practical philosophy, and Bentham was quite practical in his suggestions about crime prevention. He recommended that certain creation of a centralized police force focused on crime prevention and control, a recommendation that found life in the English Metropolitan Police Act of 1829, which established London's new police under the direction of Sir Robert Peel. This model of policing was adopted in the creation of Canada's first national police force in 1867, the Dominion Police Force. Bentham's other major contribution to criminology was his suggestion that prisons be designed along the lines of what he called a panopticon house. The panopticon was to be a circular building with cells along the circumference, each clearly visible from a central location staffed by guards. Panopticons were to be constructed near or within cities so that they might serve as an example to citizens of what would happen to them should they commit crimes. Bentham also wrote that prisons should be managed by contractors who could profit from the labor of prisoners, and that the contractor should be bound to ensure the lives and safe custody of those entrusted to him. Although a panopticon was never built in Bentham's England, French officials funded a modified version of such a prison, which was eventually built at Lyon, and 3 prisons modeled after the panopticon concept were constructed in the United States. Bentham's critics have been quick to point out that punishment often does not seem to work, and that even punishment as severe as death appears to not have any effect on the incidence of crimes such as murder um, and similar things. Such critics forget Bentham's second tenet: punishment to be effective, it must be swift and certain. So, what is the heritage of the classical school? The classical school was to influence criminological thinking for a long time and has been instrumental in molding the way in which thinkers on the subject of crime have viewed the topic for more than 200 years. The heritage left by the classical school is still operative today in the following five principles. 1. Rationality. Human beings have free will, and the actions they undertake are the result of choice. Hedonism, which is number 2. Pleasure and pain, or reward and punishment, and the major determinants of choice. 3. Punishment. Criminal punishment is a deterrent to unlawful behavior, and deterrence is the best justification for punishment. Number 4. Human rights. Society is made possible by individuals cooperating together. Hence, society owes to its citizens respect for their rights in the face of government action and for their autonomy, insofar as such autonomy can be secured without endangering others or menacing the greater good. Number 5, due process. An accused should be presumed innocent until proven otherwise, and an accused should not be subject to punishment before guilt is lawfully established. Okay, moving on to neoclassical criminology. So, what is neoclassical criminology and how does it differ from the classical perspective? How does it build on it? So, by the 19th century, classical criminology, with its emphasis on free will and individual choice on root causes of crime, had given way to another approach known as positivism. Positivism made use of the scientific method in studying criminality and was based on an acceptance of hard determinism, the belief that crime results from forces beyond the control of the individual. The original positivists completely reject the notion of free will and turn their attention to impact of socialization, genetics, economic conditions, peer group influences, and other factors that might determine criminality. Acceptance of the notion of hard determinism implied that offenders were not entirely, if at all, responsible for their crimes, and suggests that crime could be prevented by changing the conditions that produced criminality. While positivism remains an important component of contemporary criminology, many of its assumptions were undermined in the 1970s by 1. Studies that seemed to show that offenders could not be rehabilitated no matter what was tried. 2. A growing and widespread public fear of crime that led to get up of crime policies. And 3. A cultural reaffirmation of the belief that human beings had a rational nature. The resulting resurgence of classical ideals, called neoclassical criminology, focused on the importance of character, a kind of middle ground between total free will and hard determinism, and the dynamics of character development, as well as the rational choices that people make when faced with opportunities. The neoclassical movement appears to have had its start with a number of publications produced in the 1970s, such as Robert Martinson's National Survey of Rehabilitation Programs. In an often quoted article titled "What Works?", Martinson found that when it came to the rehabilitation of offenders, nothing seemed to work, as most resumed their criminal careers after release from prison. Nothing works became a rallying cry of conservative policymakers, and the "nothing works" doctrine received much public attention. Many conservative politicians and some criminologists began calling existing notions of crime prevention and rehabilitation into question and claimed that enhanced job skills, increased opportunities for employment, and lessened punishment did nothing to stem what was a rising tide of crime. In 1975, political scientist James Q. Wilson wrote Thinking About Crime, suggesting that crime is not a result of poverty or social conditions and cannot be affected by social programs. He argued for the lengthy incarceration of offenders and for the elimination of criminal opportunity. Also in 1975, David Fogel published a book called We Are the Living Proof: The Justice Model of Corrections. His justice model was predicted on the growing belief that prisoners do not rehabilitate or cure, and that criminal offenders deserve punishment because of the choices they make. Fogel argued that for the criminal justice process to work, offenders must be treated as responsible as well as accountable, that is, volitional. The American Three Strikes legislation, which mandates life imprisonment for criminals convicted of 3 violent felonies or serious drug offenses, is a reflection of the justice model. Moving on to rational choice theory. Now, rational choice theory is a product of the 1980s, mirrors many of these principles found in classical criminology. The theory, as described by Ronald V. Clark and Derek B. Cornish, rests upon the belief that individuals make a conscious, rational, and at least partially informed choice to commit crime, and employs cost-benefit analysis, as in the field of economics, viewing human behavior as a result of personal choices made after weighing both the costs and the benefits of available alternatives. Rational choice predicts that individuals choose to commit crime when the benefits outweigh the costs of disobeying the law. Crime will decrease when opportunities are limited, benefits are reduced, and costs are increased. Two varieties of rational choice theory can be identified. One builds on an emerging emphasis on victimization, and it's called routine activities theory or lifestyle theory. The second, largely an extension of the rational choice perspective, is called situational choice theory. Routine activities theory was proposed by Lawrence E. Cohen and Marcus Felson in 1979. Cohen and Felson stated that lifestyles contribute significantly to both the volume and the type of crime found in any society, and suggested that changes in American society during the 1960s and 1970s, specifically increased personal affluence and greater involvement in social activities outside the home, brought about increased rates of household theft and personal victimization by strangers. Central to the routine activities approach is the claim that crime is likely to occur when a motivated offender and a suitable victim come together in the absence of a capable guardian, meaning one who effectively discourages crime, and that a person who has taken crime prevention steps is less likely to be victimized. According to Cohen and Felson, the risk of victimization varies dramatically among the circumstances and locations in which people place themselves and their property. For example, a person who routinely uses an automated teller machine late at night in an isolated location is far more likely to be preyed upon by robbers than is someone who stays home after dark. Lifestyles that contribute to criminal opportunities are likely to result in crime because they increase the risk of potential victimization. Although a non-criminal lifestyle at certain points of one's lifetime are in part due to unavoidable social roles and assigned social positions, those who participate in a given lifestyle generally make rational decisions about specific behaviors, such as going to a particular automated teller machine at a certain time. The same is true of criminal lifestyles, hence the meshing of choices made by both victims and criminals contributes significantly to both the frequency and the type of criminal activity observed in society. In a later work, Filson suggested that a number of situational insights might combine to elicit a criminal response from individual actors enmeshed in a highly varied social world, pointing out that individuals vary greatly in their behavior from one situation to another, and that criminality might flow from temptation, bad company, idleness, and provocation. Convenience stores, for example, create temptations toward theft when they display their merchandise within easy reach of customers. Other authors have defined the term situation to mean the perspective field of the individual at a given point in time and have suggested that it can be described in terms of who is there, what is going on, and where it is taking place. So, let's say an alleged sexual predator on the loose for a year was snared by geoprofiling. Sex Crimes Unit investigators called upon Detective Constable Manny San Pedro, a geographic profiling analyst at Corporate Planning, to put his knowledge to work on a long series of occurrences involving a man exposing himself to children. Over the course of a year, there has been 20 similar occurrences in North York and Scarborough, in which a man drove up to early teen and preteen girls and exposed himself while in his vehicle. It had become an issue, said the lead investigator of Sex Crimes Unit, Detective Kim Hancock, noting the man had been targeting young girls quite often. Area schools sent out notices to parents while police issued new releases. Escalation of his behavior was a community concern. There was a partial license plate, a description of the vehicle, and a composite picture of the suspect, but all efforts to identify and find him had yielded nothing. After putting together his profile of colored maps and graphs using the Rigel Analyst software, San Pedro was left with a 292 square kilometer area crisscrossed by highways 404 and 401 to find a place where the man would strike again. Two distinct areas where occurrences had occurred stood out. He identified a peak area of 7 square kilometers. Adding the schools in the area and a 5-minute walking buffer around them for children walking home, he was left with a good target area for investigators. You identify the routine activity space for potential victims, he said, of looking for a future occurrence. By the offender's behavior so far, he is likely to return to that area, said San Pedro, who also looked for times the offender struck when children were en route to and from school. Because the case qualified as a sex crime and was more complex, San Pedro consulted with Ontario Provincial Police Geoprofiler, Detective Sergeant Brand Moore, who offered his advice on the case. San Pedro prescribed a 1-month project targeting the areas on specific days of the week at certain times of the day, briefing officers from 33 and 41 divisions where the crimes had taken place and handing them a geoprofile package. You could see the pattern, certain days and school hours, Hancock said. Manny inputted all the information and got rid of peripheral stuff and gave us an area to focus on. Teams of officers were then dispatched to the roads, San Pedro, and highlighted as potential offender trolling areas. Within 33 minutes of setting up on a driveway at a street, Constables Jessica McLinnis and Colleen Sweetnam 41st Division school liaison officers saw a van matching the description pass them. They followed the van and eventually pulled it over after the man was alleged to have driven for several blocks. Hancock said the profile helped focus the search. It was wonderful, Hancock said of the profile. It helped us focus, or it helped focus us. We had officers driving around a bigger catchment area the week before. The man was charged with invitation to sexual touching, criminal harassment, dangerous operation of a motor vehicle, 4 counts of exposure to persons under 14, and 10 counts of indecent act. It's great to see we can net some good results, San Pedro said. The analysts don't solve crimes, we provide investigative leads. It's all about the strategic deployment of resources, so you're not wasting our efforts. He said gathering more eyewitnesses accounts and other evidence makes the geomapping process more powerful because it thrives off information. He said the open lines of communication between himself and sex crime investigators helped a great deal. It's not an exact science, it's based on probabilities, said San Pedro. But what I do is not evidence. It's up to the investigators to collect that. I provide leads to to provide assistance to detectives with investigative strategies, as he said. Now moving on to the theory of social situational choice theory. It is an extension of rational choice theory, provides an example of self-determinism, which views criminal behavior as a function of choices and decisions made within a context of situational constraints and opportunities. The theory suggests that the probability of criminal activity can be reduced by changing the features of a given social situation or of the surrounding environment. Clark and Cornish, collaborators in the development of the situational choice perspective, analyze the choice structuring properties of a potentially criminal situation, defining them as the constellation of opportunities, costs, and benefits attaching to particular kinds of crime. Clark and Cornish suggested that the use of situational strategies to lower the likelihood of criminal victimization in given instances. They also recognized that the rationality of criminal offenders is inevitably bounded or limited, as it is for all of us, by the amount of and accuracy of information available to them at the time they are weighting the costs and consequences of future actions. In brief, rational choice theorists concentrate on the decision-making process of offenders confronted with specific contexts. The focus of the effort to prevent crime, from broad social programs to target hardening, environmental design, or an impediment that would dissuade a motivated offender from offending. 25 techniques of situational crime control can be identified, and each can be classified according to the 5 objectives of situational prevention. So, as I will speak about the objectives, here is what the list is. The 5 objectives are: 1. Increase the effort involved in committing a crime. 2. Increase the risks associated with crime commission. 3. Reduce the rewards of crime. 4. Reduce the provocations that lead to criminal activity. And 5. Remove the excuses that facilitate crime commission. So earlier approaches focused largely on the balance between pleasure and pain, as the primary determinant or preventer of criminal behavior, whereas rational choice theory places less emphasis on pleasure and emotionality and more on rationality and cognition. Some rational choice theorists distinguish among the types of choices offenders make as they move toward criminal involvement. One type of choice, known as involvement decisions, has been described as multi-stage and is said to include the initial decision to engage in criminal activity as well as subsequent decisions to continue one's involvement or to desist. Another type of choice, event decisions, relates to particular instances of criminal opportunity, such as the decision to rob a particular person or to let them pass, in contrast to involvement decisions, which may take months or even years to reach. Event decisions are usually made quickly. Situational crime control policy. Building on the work of rational and situational choice theorists, Israeli criminologist David Weisbrod described the advantages of situational approach to crime prevention. Crime prevention research and policy has traditionally been concerned with offenders or potential offenders. Researchers have looked to define strategies that would deter individuals from involvement in crime or rehabilitate them so they would no longer want to commit criminal acts. In recent years, crime prevention efforts have often focused on the incapacitation of high-rate or dangerous offenders so they are not free to victimize law-abiding citizens. In the public debate over crime prevention policies, these strategies are usually defined as competing approaches. However, Weisbrod pointed out that they have in common a central assumption about crime prevention, research, and policy. The efforts to understand and control crime must begin with the offender. In all of these approaches, the focus of crime prevention is on people and their involvement in criminality. A new approach developed in large part as a response to the failures of traditional theories and programs. Although this assumption, the focus on people, continues to dominate crime prevention, research, and policies, said Weisbrod, it has begun to be challenged by a very different approach that seeks to shift the focus of crime prevention efforts. For many scholars and policymakers, this meant having to rethink assumptions about criminality and how offenders might be prevented from participating in crime, with some suggesting that a more radical reorientation of crime prevention efforts was warranted. They argued that the shift must come not in terms of the specific strategies or theories that are used, but in terms of the unit of analysis that forms the basis of crime prevention efforts. Rather than focusing on people who commit crime, they called for an emphasis on the context in which crime occurs. This approach, which is called situational crime prevention, looks to develop greater understanding of crime and more effective crime prevention strategies through concern with the physical, organizational, and social environments that make crime possible. The situational approach does not ignore offenders, it merely places them as one part of a broader crime prevention equation that is centered on the context of crime. It demands a shift in the approach to crime prevention from one concerned primarily with why people commit crimes to one that looks primarily at why crime occurs in specific settings. It moves the context of crime into central focus and sees the offender as only one of a number of factors that affect it. Situational crime prevention is closely associated with the idea of criminology of place. Wiesbert suggested that a reorientation of crime prevention research and policy from the causes of criminality to the context of crime provides much promise. At the core of situational prevention is the concept of opportunity. In contrast to offender-based approaches to crime prevention, which usually focus on the dispositions of criminals, situational crime prevention begins with the opportunity structure of the crime situation, meaning the immediate, situational, and environmental components of the context of crime. This approach to crime prevention tries to reduce the opportunities for crime in specific situations through efforts as simple and straightforward as target hardening or access control. The value of a situational approach lies in the fact that criminologists have found it difficult to identify who is likely to become a serious offender or to predict the timing and types of future offenses that repeat offenders are likely to commit. Wiesbert explained that legal and ethical dilemmas make it difficult to base criminal justice policies on models that still include a substantial degree or statistical error. He added that if traditional approaches worked well, of course, there would be little pressure to find new forms of crime prevention. If traditional approaches worked well, few people would possess criminal motivation and fewer still would actually commit crimes. Situational prevention advocates argue that the context of crime provides a promising alternative to traditional offender-based crime prevention policies. They assume that situations provide a more stable and predictable focus for crime prevention efforts than do persons. In part, this assumption develops from common sense notions of the relationship between opportunities and crime. Shoplifting, for example, is by definition clustered in stores and not residences, and family disputes are unlikely to be a problem outside of the home. High crime places, in contrast to high crime people, cannot flee to avoid criminal justice intervention, and crime that develops from the specific characteristics of certain places cannot be easily transferred to other contexts. In short, situational crime control works by removing or reducing criminal opportunity. If we accept the opportunity in a cause of crime equal in importance to the personal and social characteristics that other researchers point to as causes, then much of the crime prevention work that is already being done by police agencies, private security, and businesses aimed at reducing criminal opportunity directly affects the basic causes. The crime prevention through environmental design (CPTED) or CPTED approach is one used by police services across Canada. Now, critique of the rational choice theory. Rational and situational choice theories as well as routine activities theories can be criticized for an overemphasis on individual choice and a relative disregard for the role of social factors in crime causation, such as poverty, poor home environment, and inadequate socialization. According to the study, rational choice theory does not adequately consider the impact of socio or impact of emotional states on cognitive ability and the role of psychopharmacological agents in decision making. The study examined the effects of alcohol and anger on aggression and found that alcohol diminishes individuals' perceptions of the costs associated with aggression and in some instances actually increase the perceived benefits. Similarly, high arousal levels, such as those associated with anger and other emotions, appear to impair judgment. So when acting under the influence of alcohol or when experiencing strong emotions, the individual's capacity to anticipate gratification and aversion, success and failure, and cost is diminished. The authors note that other studies show that approximately 40% of offenders are under the influence of alcohol when committing the crimes for which they are arrested, and they suggest that future research involving the rational choice perspective should include the role of emotions and the potential impact of psychopharmacological agents such as drugs or alcohol on the decisions made by people who commit crimes. One 2005 study that explored that deterrent effect of punishment offers insight into the potential that rational choice theory holds for social policy. In that study, researchers examined how juvenile offenders respond to the likelihood of significantly higher sanctions associated with criminality when they reach adulthood. They found that a 230% increase in expected sentence length was associated with only a 1.8% reduction in the likelihood of arrest. So they reasoned that even enormous increases in sentences length seem to do little to reduce the probability of repeat offending. The small behavioral responses that we estimate suggest that potential offenders are extremely impatient, myopic, or both. Rational choice theory assumes that everyone is capable of making rational decisions, when such is probably not the case. Some individuals are more logical by virtue of temperament, personality, or socialization, whereas others are emotional, hot-headed, and unthinking. Empirical studies of rational choice theory have added scant support for the perspective underlying assumption, tending to show instead that criminal offenders are often unrealistic in their appraisals of their relative risks and rewards facing them. Similarly, rational and situational choice theories seem to disregard individual psychology and morality when their emphasis on external situations. Moral individuals, when faced with easy criminal opportunities, may rein in their desires and turn their backs on temptation. Finally, the emphasis of rational and situational choice theories upon changing aspects of the immediate situation to reduce crime has been criticized for resulting in the displacement of crime from one area to another. Target hardening, a key crime prevention strategy advocated by such theorists, has sometimes caused criminals to find new targets of opportunity in other areas. Martha Stewart, born Martha Kostria, was born in 1941 in New Jersey. She was the second of 6 children. At the age of 13, she began working as a model for television and print advertisements. She attended Barnard College, where she earned her degree in European and Architectural History in 1962. She also met her husband, Andrew Stewart, at Barnard, and the two married in 1961. Daughter Alexis was born 6 years later. She worked on Wall Street until 1972, then began pursuing her dream of catering in the late 1970s. Stewart trained herself to cook by reading cookbooks by Julia Child, the famed French chef. Within 10 years, her famous cooking style and creative presentations had developed into Martha Stewart Inc., a $1 million business. Her marriage to Andrew Stewart ended in 1990, but her professional success continued to flourish. Her catering business expanded into cookbooks, magazines, and a television show, an internet site, and more, making Stewart currently worth over $1 billion. In June 2002, Stewart was investigated for participating in insider trading. She sold hundreds of shares of Amclone Systems just before the Food and Drug Administration refused to approve its new cancer drug. She resigned from the board of directors of the New York Stock Exchange and was indicted in June 2003 on charges of securities fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and making false statements to the FBI. In February 2004, a jury found her guilty of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements. She served 5 months in prison and paid a $30,000 fine. Okay, moving on to our next point. Punishments and neoclassical thought. What is the role of punishment in neoclassical thought? So punishment is a central feature of both classical and neoclassical thought, whereas punishment served the ends of deterrence in classical thought. Its role in neoclassical thinking has been expanded to support the ancient concept of retribution. Those advocating retribution see the primary utility of punishment as revenge. Modern neoclassical thinkers argue that if a person is attracted to crime and chooses to violate the law, then they deserve to be punished because the consequences of the crime were known to the offender before the crime was committed. Moreover, the criminal must be punished so that future criminal behavior can be curtailed. Notions of revenge and retribution are morally based on a sense of indignation of criminal behavior and on the sense of righteousness inherent in Judeo-Christian notions of morality and propriety. Both philosophies of punishment turn a blind eye to the mundane and practical consequences of any particular form of punishment. Hence, advocates of retributive philosophies of punishment easily dismisses critics of the death penalty, who frequently change the efficacy of court-ordered capital punishment on the basis that such sentences do little to deter others. Wider issues, including general deterrence, become irrelevant when a person focuses narrowly on the emotions that crime and victimization engender in a given instance. From the neoclassical perspective, some crimes cry out for vengeance, while others demand little more than a slap on the wrist or an apology from the offender. Just desserts. The old adage, how got or he got what was coming to him, well summarizes the thinking behind the just desserts model of criminal sentencing, which refers to the concept that criminal offenders deserve the punishment they receive at the hands of the law, and that any punishment that is imposed should be appropriate to the type and the severity of crime committed. The idea of just desserts has long been a part of Western thought, dating back at least to Old Testament times. The Old Testament dictum of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth has been cited by many as divine justification for strict punishments, although some scholars believe that in reality the notion of an eye for an eye was intended to reduce the barbarism of existing penalties, whereby an aggrieved party might exact the severest of punishments for only minor offenses. Even petty offenses were often punished by whipping, torture, and sometimes death. According to the neoclassical perspective, doing justice ultimately comes down to an official meting out of what is deserved. Justice for an individual is nothing more or less than what that individual deserves when all the circumstances surrounding the person's situation and behavior are taken into account. Now, deterrence, true to its historical roots, has a hallmark of modern neoclassical thought. In contrast to early thinkers, however, today's neoclassical writers distinguish between specific deterrence and general deterrence. Specific deterrence is a goal of criminal sentencing that seeks to prevent a particular offender from engaging in repeat criminality. General deterrence works by way of example, seeking to prevent others from committing crimes, similar to the one which a particular offender is being sentenced. Following their classical counterparts, modern-day advocates of general deterrence frequently stress that for punishment to be an effective impediment to crime, it must be swift, certain, and severe enough to outweigh the rewards flowing from criminal activity. Those who advocate punishment as a deterrent are often frustrated by the complexity of today's criminal justice system and the slow and circuitous manner in which cases are handled and punishments are meted out. Punishments today, even when imposed by a court, are rarely swift in their imposition. The wheels of modern criminal justice are relatively slow to grind to a conclusion, given the many delays inherent in judicial proceedings and the numerous opportunities for postponement and appeal. Certainty of punishment is also anything but a reality. Certain punishments are those that cannot be easily avoided, but even when punishments are ordered, they are frequently not carried out, at least not fully. If the neoclassicists are correct, ideally criminal punishments should prevent a repetition of crime or recidivism, the repetition of criminal behavior by those already involved in crime. The definition of recidivism becomes more complicated when the question of what constitutes this repeat criminal behavior is considered. Does recidivism refer to the perpetration of a new offense, to a return to the criminal justice system, or to a return to the correctional system? Does it include any breach of release conditions or only a breach of the most serious conditions? Despite the definitional challenges, recidivism can also be used to measure the success of any given approach to the crime problem. When so employed, it is referred to a recidivism rate expressed as the percentage of convicted offenders who have been released from correctional facility and who are later rearrested for a new crime or a violation of the conditions of their release, known as technical violation. While the public perception is that recidivism rates in Canada are high, the reality is somewhat different. In a recent comprehensive study issued by the Canadian federal government, offenders were tracked for up to 2 years after their release into the community. The study found that the overall reconviction rate for offenders released from federal institutions was 23%. The rate was 24% for male and 12% for females. Rates of recidivism for Indigenous offenders were higher at 38% for Indigenous men and 20% for Indigenous women. Non-violent offenses accounted for the majority of the reconvictions, while the violent reconviction rate was 12%. Let's move on to capital punishment. Notions of deterrence, retribution, and just desserts all come together in capital punishment, the legal imposition of a death sentence. The many different understandings of crime and crime control, along with arguments over free will and social determinism, combine with varying philosophies of punishment to produce considerable disagreement over the efficacy of death as a form of criminal sanction. Opponents of capital punishment make 10 claims. 1. Capital punishment does not deter crime. 2. the death penalty has been imposed on innocent people, and no workable system is in place to prevent the accidental execution of innocents. 3. Human life, even the life of a murderer, is sacred. 4. State-imposed death lowers society to the same moral or immoral level as the murderer. 5. The death penalty has been and may still be imposed in haphazard and seemingly random fashion. The death penalty, this is number 6, the death penalty is imposed proportionately upon ethnic minorities. Number 7, capital punishment goes against the most fundamental precepts of almost every organized religion. 8, the death penalty is more expensive than imprisonment. 9, capital punishment is internationally viewed as inhumane and barbaric. And 10, there is a better alternative, usually said to be life in prison without possibility of parole. Now, advocates of capital punishment generally discount each of these claims, countering with the notion that death deserves or is deserved by those who commit specially heinous acts, and that anything short of capital punishment under certain circumstances is an injustice in itself. Some people deserve to die for what they have done, such as arguments have evolved from a natural law perspective, are sometimes supported on religious grounds, and are based on the notion of just deserts. Strong feelings on both sides of the issue have generated a plethora of studies of the efficacy of fairness of capital punishment as a criminal sanction. The extent to which the death penalty acts as a general deterrent has been widely examined. Some researchers have compared murder rates between U.S. states that have eliminated the death penalty and that those have retained it, finding little variation in the rate at which murders are committed. Others have looked at variations in murder rates over time in jurisdictions that have eliminated capital punishment with similar results. It is an important recent study in which the deterrent effect of capital punishment, researchers found no empirical support for the argument that the existence or application of death penalty deters offenders from committing homicide. The study used homicide data from all 50 U.S. states and the District of Columbia between the years 1977 and 2006. And the study's design allowed researchers to both assess the impact of changes in capital punishment laws and to compare murder rates in death penalty jurisdictions with those without capital punishment laws. So regardless of studies to the contrary, many death penalty advocates remain unconvinced that the sanction cannot be an effective deterrent, saying that a death penalty that is swift and certain is likely to deter others. While capital punishment has not been legal in Canada since 1976, it remains a topic of debate. It is practiced in many states, in the United States, and in other countries including Japan, India, and China. So one of Canada's wrongful conviction cases where the courts got it wrong, they languished behind bars for years, wrongfully jailed for crimes they did not commit. But the high-profile ordeals of Donald Marshall Jr., David Milgaard, and others have put a spotlight on what has been called the fallibility of Canadian justice. These cases are not unique and certainly not isolated to Canada, although estimates of the actual number of wrongful convictions vary widely. Each miscarriage of justice, however, deals a blow to a society's confidence in the legal system. Experts say wrongful convictions undermine the two prongs of the criminal justice system's legitimacy. States 192 report prepared by the Library of Parliament. If someone is wrongfully convicted, that person is punished for an offense he or she did not commit, and the actual perpetrator of the crime goes free. To make it worse, advocates say many who were ultimately exonerated watched their applications stall for years in the Federal Review Board process. In 2000, Federal Justice Minister Annie McLean announced plans to try to prevent such cases from happening again. The changes since enacted in the Criminal Code of Canada enable the Justice Minister to use their discretion to respond to persons who believe they have been wrongfully convicted. Groups such as the Association in Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted have also advocated on behalf of those they have been jailed unfairly. Here are some of the major cases in recent Canadian history. In 1971, Donald Marshall was wrongfully convicted of murdering his friend, Sandy Seal, in the Sydney, Nova Scotia park. Marshall was just 17 years old when he received a life sentence. He was released in 1982 after RCMP reviewed his case. He was cleared by the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal the following year. Though the appeal court declared him not guilty, Marshall was told he had contributed to his own conviction and that any miscarriage of justice was more apparent than real. Marshall Mickimack was exonerated by a royal commission in 1990 that determined systemic racism had contributed to his wrongful imprisonment. The 7-volume report pointed the finger at police, judges, Marshall's original defense lawyers, Crown lawyers, and bureaucrats. Roy Ebseri, an eccentric who braced or bragged about being skilled with knives, was eventually convicted of manslaughter in Seal's death and spent a year in jail. Marshall died in a Sydney hospital in August 2009 after a lengthy illness. He was 55. David Milgaard was charged with 1969 murder. He was charged with the 1969 murder of Saskatoon nursing aide Gail Miller, and in January 1970 was sentenced to life in prison. Appeals to the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal and Supreme Court of Canada in the 2 years after his conviction were unsuccessful. Milgaard's mother, Joyce, believed that from the day he was arrested, that her son was innocent. She kept his case alive, talking to whoever would listen, and many who didn't, while he spent more than 2 decades in prison. In 1991, Justice Minister King Campbell directed the Supreme Court of Canada to review the conviction, which was set aside in 1992. Milgaard was subsequently cleared by DNA evidence 5 years later. The Saskatchewan government awarded Milgaard $10 million for his wrongful conviction in 1999. That same year, Larry Fisher was found guilty of the rape and stabbing death of Gail Miller. A provincial judicial inquiry, which released a comprehensive 815-page report in 2008 of September, concluded that the criminal justice system failed David Milgaard. The inquiry also found that Milgaard might have been released from jail years sooner if police had followed up on a lead that they received in 1980. The next cases of Guy Paul Maureen. Christine Jessup, a 9-year-old girl, disappeared from her Queensville, Ontario home in October 1984. Her body was found in a farmer's field 2 months later. Guy Paul Maureen, the Jessup's next-door neighbor in the community about 60 kilometers north of Toronto, was later charged with her murder. Maureen was acquitted in 1986, but a new trial was ordered by the Ontario Court of Appeal. At the second trial, Maureen was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He appealed and in 1995 was exonerated by DNA testing. A public inquiry into the case was called, and its report was tabled in 1998. It concluded that mistakes by the police, prosecutors, and forensic scientists combined to send an innocent man to jail. The last cases of Stephen Truscott. In 1959, Truscott was sentenced to be hanged at age 14 for a schoolmate's murder, becoming Canada's youngest death row inmate. After the conviction, he spent 4 months in the shadow of the gallows until his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Paroled in 1969, Truscott appeared into an anonymous existence in a southern Ontario city. On August 28, 2007, 48 years later, the Ontario Court of Appeal unanimously overturned Truscott's conviction and acquitted him, declaring the case a miscarriage of justice that must be squashed. The judges went on to say, however, that the court is not satisfied that the appellant had been able to demonstrate his factual innocence. In July 2008, the Ontario government announced it would pay Truscott $6.5 million in compensation for his ordeal. Now, a few questions to think about. Number 1. Canada abolished capital punishment in 1976. If this criminal sanction had still been an option, what might have happened to these men? Question 2. How do cases of exoneration, like the ones described above, influence public opinion about capital punishment? And number 3, what do you think? What are your feelings about capital punishment? Moving on to the next component, speaking about the policy implications of the classical school. So what are the policy implications of the classical school and the neoclassical thought? So during the past several decades, North American justice philosophy has been strongly influenced by the punishment practices of determinate sentencing and truth in sentencing. Because both determinate sentencing and truth in sentencing are rational forms of justice, most criminologists see them as an evolution of the classical view of crime punishment. Determinate sentencing is a strategy that attempts to address the issue of sentencing certainty. This approach mandates a specific and fixed amount of time to be observed for every offense category. Under determinate sentencing schemes, for example, judges might be required to impose 7-year sentences on offenders convicted of armed robbery, but only 1-year sentences on those convicted robbers who did not use a firearm. Determinate sentencing schemes build upon the two notions of classical thought. The pleasure of a given crime can be somewhat accurately assessed, and 2, a fixed amount of punishment necessary for deterrence can be calculated and specified. So proponents contend that determinate sentences may also reduce sentencing bias, since disparity based on race or social status would be eliminated. Canadian judges have voiced the concern that determinate sentencing models limit the amount of discretion or personal judgment they can exercise when meting out a sentence. It is unlikely that determinate sentencing models will be fully adopted in Canada, although increasing numbers of criminal code offenses carry a mandatory minimum sentence from which Canadian judges cannot vary. Official statistics indicate that there were about 338,786 adults incarcerated in federal and provincial territory custody in 2017 to 2018, 131 per 100,000 population, a decrease of 4% from 2016 to 2017. And by comparison, in 2016, the state and federal prison population in the United States stood at 1.5 million inmates, representing an increase of over 700% since 1970. Truth in sentencing is a collection of different but related public policy stances on sentencing of those convicted of crimes in the justice system. In Canada, the Truth in Sentencing Act, Bill C-25, came into force in 2010. It amends Section 719 of the Criminal Code of Canada by limiting the discretion of sentencing judges to give credit to individuals who have spent time incarcerated prior to conviction. Prior to this bill being implemented, credit for pre-sentencing custody, commonly referred to as dead time, was frequently granted a 2-for-1 credit for every day of incarceration prior to conviction. judges would credit 2 days on the sentence. As a result of Bill C-25, the credit is assessed at 1.1 and in some exceptional instances at 1.5:1. In the US, truth in sentencing requires judges to assess and make public the actual time an offender is likely to serve, 1 sentence, 2 prison, and many recently enacted truth in sentencing laws require that offenders serve a large portion of their sentence, often 80%, before they can be released. Imprisonment is one component of a strategy of incapacitation, the use of imprisonment or other means to reduce the likelihood that an offender will be capable of committing future offenses. Proponents of modern-day incapacitation often distinguish between the terms selective incapacitation, in which crime is controlled via the imprisonment of individuals, and collective incapacitation, whereby changes in legislation and or sentencing patterns lead to the removal from society of entire groups of individuals judged to be dangerous. Advocates of selective incapacitation as a crime prevention strategy point to studies that show that majority of crimes are perpetrated by a small number of hardcore repeat offenders. The most famous of those studies, conducted by University of Pennsylvania professor Marvin Wolfgang, focused on 9,000 men born in Philadelphia in 1945. By the time this cohort of men had reached age 18, Wolfgang was able to determine that 627 chronic recidivists were responsible for the large majority of all serious and violent crimes committed by the group. Other more recent studies have similarly shown that a small core of criminal perpetrators may be responsible for the most criminal activity. So who's responsible, the individual or the society? Criminal behavior, is it rational choice or adrenaline rush? So following his arrest for the theft of a police car, Moonbeam Kitaro met with one of his friends in the visiting area of the local jail. Here's what he said. "I stole a cop car and shit, was it exciting. I mean, the thing was just sitting there running in the parking lot with the keys in it. Who wouldn't take it? I've never been so high on pure adrenaline. It was an adrenaline rush, being behind the wheel of a fucking car. Or being behind of the wheel of that fucking car. It turned my girlfriend on too. I drove over to her place with the lights and siren on, and as soon as she saw the car, she wanted to go for a ride. We must have hit 140 on the highway. Then we pulled into a rest stop and made love in the back seat. It was the whole illegal thing that got her so excited, but that's when we got arrested. The cops surrounded the car, guns drawn, and all that shit. We didn't even hear them coming." So think about it. Why did Kitaro steal the car? Do you think that he knew before he stole it that the theft would lead to so much excitement? Can the desire of excitement explain crimes like Kitaro? Can the same desire explain other kinds of crime? If so, what might they be? If excitement explains crime commission, then why doesn't everyone commit crime for the excitement that it brings? Also, what kinds of crime prevention programs might be based on the principles illustrated here? Please note the example is a fictionalized one intended to encourage critical thinking. So such thinking has led to the development of incapacitation as a modern-day treatment philosophy and to the creation of innovative forms of incapacitation that do not require imprisonment, such as house arrest, use of halfway houses, or provision of career training centers for convicted offenders. Similarly, such thinkers argue the decriminalization of many offenses and the enhancement of social programs designed to combat what they see as the root cause of crime, including poverty, low education levels, general lack of skills, and inherent or active discrimination, which will lead to much reduced incidence of crime in the future, making high rates of imprisonment unnecessary. All right. Some of the critiques of the classical theories. So, what are the shortcomings of classical and neoclassical perspectives of crime? Now, classical and neoclassical thought represents more of a philosophy of justice than it does a theory of crime causation. As some writers have observed, however, the true test of Beccaria's essay can be judged by the influence it has had over time on our justice system. The influence of Beccaria, the Enlightenment, and the classical thinkers remains today in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in get-up approaches to crime, and in a continuing emphasis on individual rights. The classical school has left behind a legacy that we see in almost every aspect of our present-day justice system. Not surprisingly, advocates of today's neoclassical approaches to crime control take much of the credit for the recent drop-off in crime rates. After all, following the implementation of get tough on crime policies such as the determinate sentencing schemes called for by the just desserts model, official rates of crime have shown substantial declines. While that decrease has led politicians throughout the country to declare victory in the battle against crime, the situation is not so simple. The extent of crime's decline might not be as substantial as many people think. Publicized statistical declines may be due to, at least partially, to demographic changes in the population, or might be attributed to the changing nature of crime over time. Example, an increase in virtual or cyber thefts versus a decline in actual armed robberies. Now, dangerousness, the likelihood that an individual will later harm people or society, is a concept that can be used to decide the value of incarceration of individual cases, but it is not always recognized by get tough on crime strategies that seek to make examples of law violators based more on what they have done rather than likelihood that they will reoffend. Such critics say that it would make more sense to assess the future dangerousness of convicted offender rather than impose punishment based on the nature of their offense. Critics also charged that classical and neoclassical thought lacks explanatory power over criminal motivation other than to advance the simple claim that crime is the result of free will, the personal attractiveness of crime, and individual choice. Such critics point out that classical thought is largely bereft of meaningful explanations about how a choice for or against criminal activity is made. Similarly, classical theory lacks any appreciation for the deeper fronts of personal motivation, including those represented by human biology, psychology, and the social movement. The classical school, as originally detailed in the writings of Beccaria and Bentham, lacked any scientific basis for the claims it made, although neoclassical writers have advanced the scientific foundation of classical claims via studies such as those showing the effectiveness of particular forms of deterrence. Many still defend their way of thinking by referring to philosophical ideals just as or such as just desserts. Okay, in summary, the classical school in criminology posts that at least some illegal activity is the result of rational choices made by individuals seeking various kinds of illicit rewards. The classical perspective sees human beings as fundamentally rational, portrays pain and pleasure as the two central determinants of human behavior, and sees punishment as necessary to deter violators as to serve as an example. The Enlightenment period, or the Enlightenment, was an important influence on the classical school. Notions of free will, individual choice, deterrence as a goal of the justice system, and punishment as a natural consequence of crime owe much of their contemporary influence to the classical school. Influential thinkers of the Enlightenment era includes Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Thomas Paine, Charles Louis de Seconde Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Two important thinkers of the classical school of criminology, Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham saw crime as providing pleasure to those who commit it and believed in punishment as the way to prevent it. Neoclassical criminology is a contemporary perspective built on classical principles, emphasizing the importance of character and character development, as well as the choices people make when faced with opportunities for crime. Rational choice theory recognizes the opportunity for crime and the important role the capable guardians play in preventing it. In neoclassical criminology, punishment is seen as providing both a deterrent and just deserts. Just deserts implies that criminal offenders deserve the punishment they receive, and that any punishment meted out should be appropriate to the type and severity of the crime committed. Policy implications of the classical school revolve around the idea of a rational offender punished by a system working purposefully toward the goal of crime reduction and prevention of recidivism, and determinate sentencing. Truth in sentencing and capital punishment are all strategies developed from the classical school of principles. And lastly, classical perspectives can be criticized for their lack of comprehensive explanatory power over criminal motivation and for their lack of both meaningful explanations as to how a choice for or against criminal activity is made, and any appreciation for the deeper fronts of personal motivation. That was all for today's lesson on classical and neoclassical thought. Is it a choice or is it a consequence? Moving forward, we will be focusing on to other criminological explanations of criminal behavior, and we will be looking forward to you joining us and listening. Thank you.